Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We take from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against. We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our review with the authors.
We know you want actions, not theories, and it's actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about, helping you to become a wicked company.
So, Marcus, it's going to be a busy day for us today. We've got 2 individual podcast recordings to do. Who's up first?
So first we're going to talk to Eaon Pritchard, and we talk to him about the advertising industry and change. So he wrote a book called Where Did It All Go Wrong a few years ago, about his observations on the kind of things that started to confuse, shift, and a little bit derail, really, the advertising industry and sort of prevented them a little bit, in his opinion, sort of to really improve and progress into the new century. So without clear answers, I think it's a great document of someone who's been working really in there and who's been one of the few voices to really say, look, a lot of bullshit has happened there. There's a lot of tech we started selling without really knowing what we were doing, and it's about time to revisit that and really have a go at it. But what were your takeaways?
I thought it was really interesting because he spent so much time being a leading light and a main voice in this whole kind of advertising and marketing space in London. Now he's in Australia and he's working at a much smaller agency. And when I asked him point blank, tell me, what's the newest strategy for a brand? And his response was, if you want the really creative people doing the work and not just being wheeled out and wheeled back, then you need to work with smaller agencies. I thought that was a really kind of straightforward approach to things.
Yeah, and I think that really goes back to my own experiences, with the trend, but I wasn't quite sure at the time why, where brands were starting to really look for smaller agencies, because they could identify that smaller agencies were a bit more creative to start with and more flexible, and also they were a bit closer to the client. That was, I think, at the time the client's opinion, but there's something deeper behind it, which he elaborated on, which was what definitely my personal experience was with specialists getting hired there as innovation people, and their work never really being fully integrated or fully acknowledged. So it was more like, as you said, window dressing than actually executing on that and fully integrating that new knowledge. So in the big agencies that I used to work in, they really did not take it on board and really developed new types of ideas. They would show some things, but you would be sure it would never be done or wouldn't be executed in that way. It's quite interesting. So yeah, the small agency thing is definitely one of the things he pointed out. The other one I always found interesting, and that he alluded to as well when we started talking about Bill Bernbach, the advertising guru back from the 50s and 60s, which is probably one of the strongest, most strategic, quite intellectual advertisers from the golden age, and who's responsible for the current creative team. So the current creative team is an art director and a copywriter. And back in the 50s, that wasn't the case. Those people would sit in different rooms in different departments. And Bill Bernbach brought these 2 people together. And up till today, you go to an agency and you have a creative team with 2 people, one being copywriter, one being art director. Now, the odd thing is that hasn't changed for 50 years. Despite a lot of change having happened, no one has added any skills or different types of tools to it. So he had quite an interesting theory or proposition to say, why are we not putting someone in there that knows about technology or AI or something and actually enable teams through tools or additional people and start mixing it all up in order to really progress. So I found that quite interesting, that it's the same for creative teams as it seems to be everywhere else in any other industry, where multidisciplinary teams that can just rely on lots of different aspects of input seem to be the future.
Yeah, and then he took that a little further and said maybe you need to replace both the art director and the copywriter with a general purpose person, feed them lots of ideas that come out of artificial intelligence, that come out of AI, and let them quickly sort and sift. And I'm like, okay, that's a new approach to AI and a new application of AI that I had never thought of before.
Exactly, and it doesn't also feel necessarily like most other people are saying, "Oh, AI is just going to remove a job." I think it's going to elevate jobs rather than remove them. There's still so much stuff to do. You can just do more and test and experiment more, and I think that's a general trend we are seeing. So both, where did it all go wrong? And the book he just released, "Shot by Both Sides," is full of stories with really great relations to the music industry that he knows a lot about and his music knowledge, and trying to show a little bit how creative processes work and sort of where it got stuck and how to maybe get it into the next generation.
And I really hope that sometime during the interview he talks about the sea creature that eats its own brain. That was a great part of the book that I won't spoil for the listeners, but I hope he talks about it. But for now, Marcus, let's go to the interview.
Great, let's. So hello everyone. So this morning we have Eaon Pritchard here. Eaon, thanks for your time to make, and thanks for dialing in over from Melbourne. Good morning for us, and it's the afternoon for you. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I also good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I've nicked that from someone, but then that covers all bases. But yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, beautiful. So we want to talk about your book, or basically two of your books, because I think there's both have a really interesting angle on what's going on in the advertising industry. And so the main thing to start with, I think, would be looking at advertising, and which is full of very smart and creative people, but yet it has been struggling, like most other industries, with the change we had over the last few decades. And maybe start by telling us a little bit of what got you to write your books and sort of your views on what the message is, and what you want to bring across in your experience in that particular industry.
Yeah, cool. Well, so I've written two books so far. Doing another one just now, and it's in the beginning, I never set out to write a book. I just used to write stuff. There was a period. I mean, I was kind of late, I think, to the sort of blogosphere or whatever it was called. There was a thing in London, the planner sphere. There's a whole bunch of sort of planners that had blogs. This is around 2005, 2006. And I mean, I think blogging had been a thing for 10 years, probably before some of us got to it. But and that was all it was. So I just got, I mean, I think in the beginning it was just a lot of nonsense that I wrote, but it got me in the habit of writing things down and just writing every day. I used to, look at, at the time there was people like Seth Godin, for instance, who was, well, still popular, but I think
I've always appreciated what Seth has written, and he has a
yeah.
really good style, but a regular drip feed of content.
That's it. It didn't have to be great long essays, It could just be 2 or 3 paragraphs, So I just got in that. That was kind of inspiration, I guess, to write things, because then it could be short and it could be punchy, So I just wrote stuff, and then round about the first book came out just at the end of 2017, but a lot of the material in that was maybe had been built up over about 2 years. And I had 3 or 4 quite long sort of blog article type things, or things that I'd written for the industry press. And I thought, hang on, there's a little sort of connection, little thread here. And I was getting a little bit more confident in my own writing. It was less of a, I wasn't just sort of trying to sound like Seth Godin. I think when you write, it takes a wee while to find your own voice. And it got to the point where I think, well, whatever my voice is, this is it. And I thought, what the hell? I'll put together a book. So I had 4 or 5 sort of articles that maybe added up to about 10,000 words, and then I just wrote the rest around that. and just wrote about things that I was interested in, which was mostly movies and music and culture, and just sort of framed problems that I saw in the advertising industry around those kind of things. Other person whose writing I liked, although I didn't really sort of copy it, but did a similar thing. I think is Dave Trott. So I don't know if you know his stuff. He's got a very unique style. It's very punchy. It's like written like a copywriter. Like every line is a headline. But I think
What's an example of one of his books?
well, he's done about 5 books. 1 + 1 = 3. Predatory Thinking. Creative Mischief, I think, was another one. There's another couple.
Okay.
I can't remember. But he writes a regular column for one of the trade press things in London, Campaign or something.
Okay.
But Dave, I think he's kind of semi-retired now, and I think he sits and watches the History Channel, and kind of so he's always using these sort of war metaphors and stuff, So, but I was kind of influenced by that thing as well, of like taking things from a different context and and using them to illustrate advertising.
But I think if you can take pop culture or even mainstream culture references and then use that as a basis for explaining industry things that are happening, it gives people an extra anchor point to relate to what you're talking about. And I think it's a really good writing strategy.
Yeah, yeah. Although, I mean, people, you'd have to be over a certain age probably to to relate to some of my cultural reference points. It's sort of, I'd say to kids today, talk to them about the Slits. They don't know what you're talking about. But,
It'll do them good to do some research.
Yeah.
Well, there's just it also makes it quite nice because there's a lot of really quotable anecdotes from the music side to it that you're kind of tying into those, and I think it makes a really good way of reading it, both in Where Did It All Go Wrong and in Shot by Both Sides. It's also interesting the way you make your points of what's sort of been happening in the music industry or art as well. I think especially the second book, there's a lot of art in there around painters and how they got to where they were and the issues they had, and sometimes how they bumped into each other and try to help each other to get into the new world. I think there's a nice story in the second one around Rauschenberg, trying to get something off what was it, Willem de Koning?
Willem de Kooning, yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting how you bounce it back with what's going on in the industry and how people move into sort of the next phase of things.
Yeah, it was funny because I in the end, with that Shot by Both Sides book, it kind of wrote itself in a way, and when it was done, I felt like I'd actually kind of figured out a problem that I'd sort of come to terms with something, or the writing had actually helped me understand something I didn't understand, which was kind of, I sometimes say it was kind of making peace with postmodernism, to a degree. I mean, it's hard to pin down, what is postmodernism. I mean, it's it's everything and anything, but some aspects of it, and I felt less sort of angry towards the post-modernity afterwards, but that's maybe getting a bit introspective and navel gazing. So
well, talk about maybe not navel gazing, but maybe war stories in this case. So especially in Where Did It All Go Wrong. So, and that's where Troy and me probably have very similar experiences, which is about how the advertising world started to react or implement or just added all these new digital and social media and whatever just came along to their service offer and the way they go about stuff and what they offered to clients. So there's a couple of things you mentioned in terms you create there, from the deluded amateur overvaluing the new to what I call, or there's a German term called the Fachidiot, which sort of this narrow specialist of I know this, therefore that's the only, the hammer and the kind of problem as nails kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have imposter syndrome of people who actually know something about that.
Yeah.
And introverts are losing at the table, and the dynamics at agencies, which are a lot about people just using a lot of bullshit to talk over other people or look as if they know what they're talking about,
Yeah.
and the damage that can do. So tell us a little bit more about some of the experiences there and some of the things you found.
Yeah. Well, one of the things there was. So I don't know if you've heard of. I mean, this is in I reference this in the book, but it's what they call Sturgeon's Law or Sturgeon's Revelation. So Theodore Sturgeon is a science fiction writer and critic, and very much a sort of impresario, for the sort of science fiction genre. In the 60s, he actually wrote some of the early episodes of Star Trek, which I did. It was only when I was sort of researching them a bit more I found that out. But the story goes that there'd been a review in the New York Times literary review. The Theodore Sturgeon has had, and the reviewer kind of decided to use Sturgeon's work to have a pop at the whole genre, and he said, that 90% of science fiction writing was crap, and then the story goes that Sturgeon had this sort of revelation because he realized that the critic was saying nothing, because science fiction writing conforms to the same sort of pattern of criteria as any other form of cultural production or creativity, and 90% of everything is crap. And so this was his sort of revelation, but I think I kind of like that. And I thought, what happens with technology, particularly in advertising and comms, but I'm sure it's the same in other industries as well, where there's new technology coming in. For a little while, anything new seems to be exempt from Sturgeon's law, whether it's content marketing or Facebook ads, and it seems to be that just the fact of doing it at all gets celebrated, and then but then eventually it does conform, and you realize that most of it is crap, but the sort of I got into trouble once at a media agency I worked at, because I saw a lot of the younger kids, were walking about wearing Instagram T-shirts or Snapchat T-shirts, the swag that they'd been given. And so, I went to the people at the head of the agency, and I said, I think we should stop the kids from wearing that, because if clients come in and see them all walking about with all their Twitter swag and everything, and then we make recommendations to use Twitter, it's not a good look, because it's kind of the idea of enclosed cognition. So but when people are asked to do math problems and they wear a white, a scientist's white coat, they tend to do better, because they subconsciously think they're scientists. But yeah, and so it was there was a kind of frustration of just any, I think probably the same thing is going on now with TikTok or whatever the latest thing is. It's like all of a sudden for a short while it's exempt from any critical thinking just because it's the new thing.
But you said you got in trouble. Why did you get in trouble for pointing out something that I agree with?
Well, because this would be bad for morale, you see, and I would be like the grumpy old bastard, It's like, am I allowed to swear? That's not really swearing, is it? You can beep it. Yeah, that was not being. The other thing is, especially in big agencies and global networks, there's this relentless kind of pressure for positivity and enthusiasm, for any idea, no matter how idiotic, you must be positive about it. So yeah,
it's probably
complaining about kids
it's
wearing Instagram T-shirts, that was that didn't go down
That's
well.
his Instagram T-shirt. I can imagine in a creative industry not allowing someone to wear a quirky, weird, whatever T-shirt is sort of, hang on a second, isn't that our uniform by definition?
Yeah.
Are allowed to run around in T-shirts instead of
Yeah.
a suit.
Well, that's fine,
Yeah,
but
I mean,
coming,
yeah,
wear a sort of ironic, Ramones T-shirt, even though you've never heard the Ramones. That's fine,
yeah,
but
yeah.
but it's a bit like because Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, they are all vendors, So if, you wouldn't walk about wearing the Channel 9 News T-shirt
So,
or a
that's the
Daily
weird
Mail.
thing. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that kind of bias or preference towards a certain solution is really.
Yeah,
It's odd what seemed to happen because it was anything. If I remember back, it was anything from doing more digital banners, even knowing that the click rate of these banners always was crap. It was
yeah,
always not a great investment.
yeah,
To the fact when they, I think, first tried to put together in a campaign, a Facebook aspect and a TV aspect, and there was just no data yet on what the actual impact is, how much Facebook elevates TV or not, or how they run separately, or how to treat all of
yeah,
that. I think at the beginning, fair enough, there wasn't enough data on this till I
yeah,
think Facebook commissioned a couple of campaigns just to actually test if there's an impact on what.
yeah,
And no surprise, what came back obviously was that there was quite a positive impact. But you would look probably at that quite carefully as well and go like,
yeah,
where did it come from again?
yeah,
And but it's mad to see. I remember being at one of the agencies, and I actually was at borderline a board meeting or a leadership meeting, and people were really looking for innovation in the sector, and so they were going, well, we invited Google a couple of weeks ago and did an innovation workshop with them, and sort of obviously a lot of results came back or propositions came back like to use a lot of their Google services. And I
yeah,
was sitting and go like, yeah, why did you invite them in the first place? Because they're actually competition.
yeah,
You know what I mean? Because at the time they already had, what was it called, Zoo or something? So they had
yeah,
agencies within Google that actually directly worked with clients, the same clients that some other agencies worked with.
yeah,
And I was flabbergasted that they weren't even aware of that kind of stuff. So I
yeah,
think it might have taken a long time before they even before agencies even understood
yeah,
that they're actually talking to the competition. And
yeah.
they're paying the competition to come in and get an insight into everything, how their inner workings.
Yeah. But I
So,
mean, that's the kind of stupidity of agencies, in a way, because they can't see that. Google and Facebook, they are not daft. You know what I mean? But they are the sort of smiling assassins, because they've just got their eye on, because if they become. I mean, already I think, and it's probably more than this now, but I think I quote these things in the book, so it's a couple of years older now, so it's probably more. But I think something like 70% or 70 cents or 70 pence in every pound spent in digital advertising goes through those two.
yeah.
Um,
Oh, it's just Google alone now has search ads. I think is 67% of the market is them.
right.
Or
Okay.
just something
Yeah.
there. It's immense. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
and especially media agencies, I think they're in grave danger of just being irrelevant, because the Facebook and Google, between them are just gonna eat uh, that whole business. But they're smart because they know that the agencies are full of uh, people who do not fundamentally don't understand the business they're in, and can be bought, for pens and T-shirts.
Okay,
Uh,
so I understand what you're saying. I even agree with a lot of what you're saying. What do we tell the people who are listening that they should be doing? If you're an agency, what should you do differently? If you're hiring an agency, what should you do differently so you don't get totally boondoggled by the two gorillas in the market?
I mean, I think there's been this, what is it? Is it Hanlon's razor? Never attribute to malice that's more easily explained by stupidity. So it's kind of I think it's been a perfect storm of kind of margins getting squeezed. So the agencies can carry fewer senior people, who can do critical thinking. Um, I fear, for there's an interesting trend. I don't know what's going on in the UK. There's an interesting trend going on in Australia here, where um, just in the last sort of 6 months, I mean, gradually a lot of senior people have been getting the boot from agencies just because of the downturn in business to do with, because of the health situation. But we're seeing lots and lots of little independent, little 2 or 3 person creative companies springing up. And it's, I think, and these are the senior people, the people who can think, who have experience, who know how things work, and they're surplus to requirements from the big networks. But I think that the whole industry itself is going to be squeezed. I mean, spend is like dramatically down this year so far, and I think it's the big networks that are going to suffer for that. And so maybe there's a little sort of renaissance at grassroots level, with because I think people are realizing one of the benefits of technology and automation and stuff is that you can do things with far fewer people now. You don't need to have if you've got one technology person that knows their way around some kind of machine learning algorithm, that can do the work of 30 juniors, that would sit there, cranking out spreadsheets and things like that. So you know
So that's something I would like to pick up on again, because again you said, like, something around the senior people who are still smart enough or have been around long enough to see the difference, whereas if you, for margin reason, hire a lot of young people, that you also believe, oh well, it's the young people, they know social media in and out because they got born around it, so they'll do a better job at it.
yeah
And in my experience, because I got hired into agencies and other industries as well as sort of the innovation guy, right? Because I knew a bit
yeah
of tech. And the thing there is that then the odd thing then was, so you get hired in as a specialist who's hired with the perception that I know more, and I definitely did. But then at the table itself, the dynamics always seemed to be quite skewed against me, to be honest. So even
yeah
so, I was a native tech person growing up through the dot-com boom. And even so, I could relate to the issues and challenges the industry had. It was really tricky often to get through the dynamics of people who were just talking louder and bullshitting better. And that seemed to be a culture and dynamic, in particular in agencies, potentially a little bit more than other industries.
yeah
However, I've seen similar dynamics happening in other industries, like at the moment there's a lot of management consulting going on.
yeah
In obviously in the big consultancies, and I worked in a lot of these transformation projects. They're all same thing. You bring a lot of more digital thinking. What does it mean? What do you really want to do as an organization? Where do you want to go with this? And it's the same struggle. They don't know
yeah
either, right?
yeah
But even so, it's a different industry, and it's less about creative ideas. It's about, well, how are we going to invest into the next step? And yet again, you often have the loudest voices or people who are there to sell an account and grow an account be the loudest voice and say, no, that's what we're going to do, and we know exactly what we're doing, and this is where we should be going.
mm,
Clients don't know any better.
mm,
The people who are actually the specialists are not necessarily in the position or are underplayed for some reason. I have no idea why. So the specialists who actually know what they're talking about are underplayed in those cultures.
mm.
Um, so how much, I mean, do you think that's more like an endemic thing? How much is that an endemic thing or a problem towards anyone who actually understands to have a voice or actually having the right conversation on any table to not do the stupid thing?
I mean, I get the I mean, it's funny you say that because I mean, I have a sort of similar story. You know, when I first came out here to Australia, because I'd been like a big mouthpiece in London for digital and social and everything, 10, 12 years ago. And I mean, I changed my mind about a lot of that stuff. But in the beginning, so I came out, I got brought out to do this big job at a agency out here, big network agency. And the biggest mistake that I made, because I was the digital innovation guy, similar to you, right? But the biggest mistake I made was not understanding the cultural or sort of political situation in the agency. I thought I just, naive me, I thought I was there to actually do things. But that was my big mistake. I was just there to say things, and to get wheeled out, and just talk some digital,
Yeah.
stuff and sound clever, and then just go back to my desk, and write articles for the trade press. As soon as I started trying to actually get involved in the work, that was my undoing, because certainly 10 years ago that it was very much appearances were important. It was window dressing, and so I don't know if you were like the guy, because I had no team or anything. I
Same
just yeah
same thing. Yeah.
yeah
They had, so they were claiming to do whatever. What was it at the time? A creative technologist or whatever, or
yeah
innovation manager, director or whatever. And I,
yeah
I, I got so frustrated at some point. I actually bought myself a lab coat and started really buying into the whole mad professor thing. Because basically, no, but it was from a professional perspective. I
yeah
had really bad stories where I had pitch decks being tampered with
yeah
uh, without my doing and that kind of stuff, getting into my work because people
yeah
thought they know better and they
yeah
didn't. It was very embarrassing at points and parts where I had to leave. But that's exactly my thing. So when what can you do about it? Are you saying it's better to know the politics more? Is there anything where or know business more in order to really go in there and say, look, I know this better, but without consent, without convincing you in your language, it's just not doable. I mean, what's the chance we're having there?
yeah.
Like, what worked for you apart from what didn't work? What
It,
you know?
it, well, I don't know if it ever worked. I just keep making different mistakes. But I mean, there is, I mean, I guess, advice I sort of give. Um, God knows why, but occasionally, you know, younger people ask me for career advice. And after saying, "Look at what I did," and then don't do that. Um, but I think, I'd say that it's really important to understand the just the any place that you go, you need to understand the agendas, uh, that are in there, because what is said and what is actually going on are usually, completely different. And it's naive to take things on sort of face value. That uh, all of the talk about company culture and about purpose and all that. That's all very well as long as you don't take it too seriously, because because there's always something else going on. So for the likes of you and I that did those sort of ill-fated digital innovation roles, 10 years ago. Um, I wish I'd been a bit smarter then and realised this is window dressing, right? Uh, and then it would all been a hell of a lot easier. And so I would have just right, how grandiose can I make my proclamations, But the funny thing was, it was actually during that period, I'd been one of the clients that we had was well, I won't say the name, but anyway, they were unbeknown to me, they're a sort of what do you call it, affiliate or subscriber to the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, right? So that's you've heard of How Brands Grow and Byron Sharp and stuff. So it's a kind of evidence-based marketing thing. It's not. I still wouldn't say it's popular, but it's increasing in popularity. But back in 2010, it was the book How Brands Grow had just came out, and this was heresy as far as a lot of advertising and marketing was concerned. Although it was sort of evidence based. Anyway, I'd been wheeled out to see this client, and I would talk in my usual kind of my big thing: the sky is falling, advertising's dead. People want to have conversations with brands, all that kind of stuff. And I got pulled to one side by a brand manager, and she gave me the book, so How Brands Grow. It was hot off the press, and she said, "You'll get nowhere with these people talking like that because they don't believe in that. What they believe is this." And it was, it's all about reach and about people are not that interested in brands. People just want to buy stuff and get on with their lives and everything. And so I read that, over a period of about a year, and that was when the penny dropped. And I thought, well, I've come out here to do this job that they don't really want me to do. They just want me to talk about it. And not only that, I can't even talk about it because I don't even believe any of that anymore, And so it was a kind of, double sort of whammy where I suddenly woke up to the sort of reality of how marketing and advertising actually does work. And then I had to change my mind about a lot of things, So when I sort of complain in the book about people who have eaten their own brain or whatever, I was that person, so it's not me being a smarty pants and pointing the finger. It's kind of semi-autobiographical. But what I was able to do was change my mind in face of new evidence, even though it was probably detrimental to my career at the time, But I was a lot happier after that. I think I've went a long way from the question. But
it's nice because Marcus really pointed it out, and I loved it as well. Your story about the sea squirt. It has a rudimentary brain. It navigates around. It finds the rock, kind of attaches itself, and then eats its own brain because it doesn't need it anymore.
Yeah.
And you are in effect a failed sea squirt because you kept your brain. You realized the rock wasn't the right one, and you let go, and you went looking for other rocks.
That's right. Yeah. When the easy thing to do would have just been to just to eat my brain, but
as is evidenced by a lot of people who are still in the advertising industry, they have eaten their own brain.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes if I'm talking at something, I kind of that's my kind of opening sort of little slide, because if you get the audience to have a bit of a laugh, then you're on your side, so then you can give them some more controversial stuff after that, but it's funny because I get halfway through the story and then I see people starting to smile because they know what's coming,
Right. they can see it coming. Absolutely.
Yeah.
They can see it coming.
Yeah.
So, but that's interesting because I think, when we talk about that, and that's because again, I see so many parallels in different industries, and advertising being the one we're talking about, and then looking at digital transformation, or now what sort of a newish appearing sector that is gaining a more value and attention, with service design. And service design is a bit struggling from the same maladies of being now perceived maybe because of the previous social media and some of its failings in terms of what people were promising. So it's seen as the fluffy stuff rather than, no, hang on a second, this actually informs your bottom line. You can actually convert people, retain people much better if you invest in this and if you understand the customer better. So the trouble there is similar to the early days, so like 10, 12 something years ago, with things like Facebook. What's the impact? Well, no one's measuring it. Why is no one measuring it? Well, the service designers are only sat down when they're given the brief and it's already pre-designed, or the insights are not really being listened to, or they're not getting evidenced into more quantitative data. And so they never get turned around into the bottom line. So no one ever gives them, oftentimes I found myself in that situation where you not get to talk to finance to go, can we have a look at all the money we spent and what the impact of that was, and can we actually run the numbers? Oftentimes that never happens, and I think organizations are struggling with that. So the way I found is that if you don't measure, or as they say, if you don't measure it, it doesn't exist, right? So how do you get those new measurements in? Because I bet if you dig into social media, there is some benefit, but no one can really talk about it, or you can't really believe in it unless you actually been in front of it. And that goes back to your story about the people who just look for reach, where you could probably say two things to them. One is that yes, reach does this and this and that, but also it affects other areas, and that's what you also should be interested in. So
And
to have
you,
an informed conversation, it's tricky, right? To go in and break with a belief system if you can't really fully speak their language, and you don't have enough yet to back up what you're
Yeah.
trying to sell to them.
but as you point
That's
out, Marcus, what gets measured gets managed. And I think in agency land, the last thing they want to do is actually measure the impact of their campaigns. Because if the brands actually realized how little impact they were having, they'd sack them.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess. See, I mean, it's been well known, in advertising for a long, long time that the effects of advertising are relatively weak, right? But they're cumulative, and it's Coca-Cola is so you need very little cue from Coca-Cola to be able to get an impression. The color red and the white ribbon, that's enough. But that's testament to 100 years or whatever of consistent, solid, brand building over time, not being distracted by, well, not to say distracted, but making a clear distinction between what kind of activities build a brand and what kind of activities drive activation.
Mm-hmm.
And you could probably add, service into that as well. Now, brand experience if you count all of that stuff as part of brand experience, right? Everything from advertising through to customer service to, whatever. Obviously, that whole set has, increased in complexity uh, in the last 10, 15 years, because of the amount of new touch points and channels, which means that a brand experience project, probably needs more people in there designing it, more specialisms. But they still need to come together. I think um, there's still a sort of now I don't know whose sort of fault it is, but brand people and digital people and technology people don't necessarily always sit together and share problems and work them all out. I kind of think thinking of an account planner, right, or a strategist in an agency. Originally their job was just to you know find a sort of consumer insight, turn that into a proposition, and then go and test creative executions with consumers, and that was it. But I mean, that's not enough anymore. In fact, you could argue that some of that actually doesn't need to be done anymore, but they need to be far more aware of. I mean, there's a thing I'm working on just now with a fintech startup. The thing that's causing me the most problem is just looking at the when someone signs up for a trial, and then what's the little sequence of email messages that we ping them, to activate them, because only a small percentage sign up and then start using it straight away, and they need prodded and nudged. Now, going into your average network ad agency and talking to planners in there about, what little, persuasive messages are we going to ping at people to try and activate them on the service? They're not interested in that. But although they're small interactions, they're absolutely, critical to to bringing customers into a service. So, So there's a lot of the complexity has increased, and then of course if as I sort of proposed that the level of critical thinking uh, you know isn't there, it gets left to the engineers to design these experiences, and of course they, great engineers, but probably don't know that much about human behavior, which is supposed to be the sort of insight planner's job. It's just a lack of sort of cohesion in the complexity, where there's more people in the mix, but it seems to be getting worse rather than better.
Yeah, so I find that really interesting, as you just said, those the people of particular practices who should be sitting together are actually not sitting together, and new skills should be entering the teams. And it always reminds me of when I first got into agencies, and I started to read up a little bit more on history of advertising and all these things. And one of the oddest stories I always found sitting there around about to 2010 or something, to read up about Bill Bernbach and the fact that he sort of created the modern creative teams. So before that, I didn't know that there are creative teams, that are actually two people in one room at the same time. Some of them having worked longer together
Yeah.
than they actually been married to their spouses and these kind of things. And
Yeah.
it was a really, really odd dynamic. Now I met two guys who worked on a McDonald's account for, and they were actually had worked longer together than they were married to their wives, which was really cute in some sense. But but that's a copywriter and an art director.
Yeah.
So, and for anyone who doesn't know that story, they were sitting at different levels in different parts of the buildings back in the days.
Well,
And
that's
he
it. I mean,
brought
I
them
think,
together in a room
yeah,
to say, hey, there's synergy here if you work on ideas together. And he created, to some extent, because of that, outstanding and better work. And then it took 6-7 years, I think, before every other agency adopted the same principle. But oddly enough, that was back in the 60s or something. So I was sitting and going like, okay, for about half a century, the advertising industry didn't have the idea that maybe it's about time to add another skill set to it. Not that it's three people, but just somehow add something to this team or evolve it. And it seemingly hadn't. And that gets me into what you mentioned, just with behavioral science and some of those new things that are coming about to really understand people better and refocus on that. So what are your thoughts on is how we should maybe tackle that in terms of importance? Is there something that could contribute,
yeah. I
or
mean,
how, to
definitely.
the
So
value of ideas that our agencies are selling? Because that's the value they're struggling with, isn't it? To say
yeah.
that's still a value, that's still what we're selling. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I definitely have a point of view on that, right? So this is my Bill Bernbach moment, so I probably won't, get any credit for this until I'm long dead. But, but I think we're definitely on the, everyone thought, maybe 10 years ago, everyone thought that, so there was a notion that the creative team of art director, copywriter, was no longer optimum, right? Because of the impact of technology, and so the idea was to have a three-way creative team, right? And this was the creative technologist that was going to be the person. Now that was sort of tried, and it didn't really work, and then it's sort of gone out of fashion. But I think the next sort of iteration of that, and I'm almost certain, is really going to be, it's going to be, so the kind of catchphrase for this, I don't know if I coined this or I stole it from someone else, but I'm using it anyway, which I'm calling augmented creativity, and that's where some sort of, for instance, a copywriting AI, right, that does headlines, that can just produce, endless combinations of things much faster than any human can. And then the role of the creative person is more like a sort of selector. And so, so the AI can make these suggestions, and the creative person is going, yeah, I'll use that. No, 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 yeah. And so there's not going to be a creative team of a writer and an art director. You're just going to have this one sort of general purpose creative person with an AI assistant that's kind of throwing loads of suggestions
That's really
around.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
because I think that goes to a potential trend of saying that automation might not take jobs away; they're just going to elevate and augment jobs. And some of the tools are
yeah.
already there. I know at least of one company that optimizes photos according to holiday trips you can book and which photos have a higher click-through rate and that kind of stuff. It sounds totally
Yeah.
along those lines. It's really, really interesting
Yeah,
idea.
well, I'm fascinated by that as well. I think, and it's so funny because you'll get every now and again someone come up and like, oh, here's a piece of music. This AI created something that sounds like the Beatles, and you listen to it, and it doesn't even sound like the Ruttles. It's kind of like, but that's not the finished piece, right? That's a suggestion, right? So the algorithm has crunched all these Beatles songs, come up with this thing, and it gives it to you. But then the musician takes that away and then plays it, because that song would sound great if it was done by a person. It's just when it's being sung by the AI, it sounds shit. So it's the combination of human and machine. I think that's kind of fascinating. And then the role, I think, for what used to be account planning or strategy, again, there's so much of the uh, even, I mean, I'm just sitting here at home, so I'm an independent person, so I don't have the massive array of tools that a big network agency had. But with a few rudimentary tools, I can do things to size audiences and crunch numbers that would have taken weeks, 5 years ago, just on my own. So I don't need to worry about that anymore. And that's, so I mean, the sort of, little consultancy that I'm doing at the moment, we're working in what I'm calling applied evolutionary psychology, right? So we can spend our human time, really digging into the sort of roots of human behavior and what are the fundamental motives, and the sort of evolutionary origins of behavior, and that's far more interesting material to then give to a creative person to work with their little AI. They can plug in these various criteria, and then the algorithm makes all these great suggestions. It's an interesting next evolution, I think, of how commercial creativity, is going to work. So I'm hoping, like I said, that's going to be my burn back moment in 30 years' time. People will remember this podcast where it was all it was all revealed.
So,
Yay!
so can I bring a lot of this stuff together? I mean, that's really interesting that you're doing that in a small 2 to 3 person agency, focusing on applied evolutionary psychology. Is that what you said? What
Yeah,
was the
yeah,
phrase? And you're
uh,
really focused on outcomes. Some people who work for
yeah,
for brands are focused on, I've got 5 million, I've got 10 million, I've got 50 million, and I've got to spend it. And that's kind of how much do I spend more than what do I actually achieve. And we talked about there's so many people in agencies that
yeah,
that are wrapped in politics, which amongst my friends I talk about, it's the Game of Thrones happening within the company, where everyone's got their own agendas and everything else. If you are a brand, how do you go about deciding the right agency to use?
um, yeah. I mean, it's I think there's no sort of one answer. It's because if you're Coca-Cola, for instance, um, I'd imagine. I mean, I've been in an agency where Coca-Cola was the client, right? I mean, we never we just got it by default because some decision was made in New York that, right, our global agency of record is X, and so everyone around the world then inherited that account, and but the big decisions were made in New York, and we localized things and had some, you know, conversation with the local team. So there's, that's like one situation where if you're in a big big agency, you inherit clients, and that's it. If I was a reasonable sized Australian business shopping around for an agency now, I'd be looking at, for a start, I'd be looking at independence, right? Because you know that whoever you're going to go and talk to has got some sort of, skin in the game, right? Because it's their business, it's on the line, and if if they mess it up, then the consequences are, graver than if a big network agency messes it up. They can sweep that under or absorb, that thing. So, let's say, I've been watching definitely the last 6 months. There's lots and lots of little 2 or 3 person operations popping up that can deal with, you'd be amazed at the size of a client a small operation can deal with. And then there's bigger independents of 25, 30 people that could handle any bit of global business and the major clients. So, I think, I'm probably biased because I'm in that tiny space myself. But certainly I think, the smaller independents, they've got skin in the game, and the need to do well. I'd be looking at those. I'm sure it's the same in London as well.
And they're not going to take the really super knowledgeable creative person and just wheel them out, have them do a presentation and stick them back under the rug.
Exactly.
They're actually going to be part of the process.
Well, that's right, because anyone that's in there has got to pay their way, haven't they? They can't afford to sort of, a little agency can't afford that kind of window dressing. They've got to, everyone that's in there has got to count.
Well, we're just about the end of our time today. Is there any closing thoughts or closing ideas that you'd like to share with the people who are listening today?
No, not really. I just my the second book hasn't sold quite as well as the first one. I think I kind of, because it came out in January. It takes about 6 weeks to build, and then we went straight into the COVID situation. Nobody was buying anything, so I'm gonna sort of relaunch that one later in the year. So yeah, so that's
we'll be sure and put the links to both of the books in the show notes so that any of our listeners can more easily find them and help wherever we can to spread the word.
All right, brilliant. Thank you.
Marcus, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah. So thank you, Eaon. I think this was very inspiring. I think we touched a lot of interesting subjects and shared a couple of war stories. I think there's a lot in there in terms of, just. I always like to see parallels between industries and know that, advertising was probably hit a bit earlier with change than other industries. So I think other industries can learn from that. The fact that you look at, team dynamics all the way to looking differently how technology doesn't necessarily solve something, but can actually enable the process. And I think in particular, when you look at something that is sort of the creative sector and ideas being really often hard to evaluate, and then advertising on top of it being really hard to evaluate where your money goes, knowing the famous quote of the 50% of the ad money, not knowing which 50% makes the impact. I think thank you so much. It was lovely to hear all that, and good luck with the second book, and thank you for your time, Eaon.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks very much for having me. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.